Thank you for joining us on our third installment of our Cloud Security and Validation webinar series. I am joined today with my Marianne Silva, the Manager of Quality and Regulatory Compliance for USC Clinical Laboratories. I'm Erin, Wright, the Validation Product Manager for MasterControl, and we're going to be talking through the process of migrating to the cloud from a quality and validation perspective. Marianne, thank you so much for joining us.
It is an absolute pleasure to be here, Erin, really.
Now, Marianne and I have a little bit of history. We've worked together the entire time that she has been a customer of MasterControl. And so tell us a little bit about your implementation of MasterControl.
We started in 2013 on version 10.1.2 quite a while ago. And we had a great deal of success and growth with that version. Started with just 2 hospitals and 3 additional laboratories, and then continued to grow to where now we have the 2 hospitals and 7 additional clinical laboratories and 4 different anatomic pathology laboratories as well, all on MasterControl. So the growth has been great, but it was a transition from 10.1.2, and then of course with recent growth in MasterControl and the incredible opportunities that became available with upgrades to 11.7 was the first time we had our first upgrade, and then again to 2018.3 and 2019.3. So we've gone through several transitions, and it's been a wonderful journey. It really has been very good.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. So you were on a hosted environment as opposed to a cloud environment previously.
Correct. We were on a hosted environment at the very beginning, and now we've moved to the cloud. We went to the cloud with 11.7.
Okay. So what was one of the things that kind of drove you to the cloud? What was the game changer for you for that change?
You know, it really is where everything is going as far as the future of everything is going to the cloud. It really is the sustainable way to prepare for the future. So it really was not a difficult decision for us whatsoever. It really was preparing for the future.
Okay. Right. No, and I know when we had talked previously, the idea of getting up on the current version was so important to you. Being able to upgrade to get so many new features and defects resolutions for your software version.
Absolutely. There were so many changes between the version that we had been on, and just realigning with best practices. It was really a time for us to stop and check and see where we were versus where we really could be, and how much better of a tool it would be for us in our work environment. So the transition to 11.7 into the cloud really was the way to go. It was just a very reasonable decision.
Absolutely. And so what we recommend for other customers looking to migrate to the cloud is looking and being aware of what version of the software that you're on and what version you're going to, and kind of examining those deltas. And like Marianne said, looking at the configuration best practices and how they might have changed between version to version. Because as new features and new enhancements are released, how you use the software might be a little bit different. And obviously identifying a vendor that you trust, that you host your data for security and for regulatory compliance, as well as managing your system. And so having that trust in a software, I think, is one of the key points in getting ready to migrate to the cloud. So what research did you guys do for cloud migrations? Did you talk to other customers or hear any stories of other successful implementations before moving to the cloud?
We talked to other customers, of course, but we also talked to our IT department as far as where IT was going as an organization, you know, with our own facility and our own organization. So there really wasn't a lot of question or doubt that it should be anything but moving to the cloud.
Which brings us to our next point of really embracing that digital mindset, being able to transition that thought process of having everything under lock and key under your servers, in your environment, or even having just paper documents that you can physically hold on to, of really embracing that digital global cloud mindset and unleashing the IT groups onto the clouds. Another key part of being able to migrate your data is, especially if you're using the data in your production system, is starting those data qualification protocols and understanding what data you have currently in your production site and what you'd want to verify to make sure that it's transitioned over appropriately. And it's really important, as well as when you're migrating to the cloud, to have a comprehensive migration plan. MasterControl, when we do our cloud migrations, have a really strong process that we do in place because we want to make sure that this is a seamless experience for our end users. This kind of migration plan should ensure that you minimize disruptions in business operations and make sure that you're not feeling any of the changes. That it's like flipping on a switch and all of a sudden that you're on the cloud. One of the key points as well with the migration is making sure that your IT team is on board with these changes. I know that your IT group is excited and thrilled to be moving to the cloud.
Absolutely.
What was some of the main drivers for your team?
Really, it was all guided by the technical support team from MasterControl. We just followed the project master plan. Everything was broken down into separate individual steps of what needed to be done and when it needed to be completed by. We did look at what we were using the system for, how it was being used, where the data was housed, and who needed what information when. And the transition was really made to be quite seamless. There was a lot of work. I will not deny that there is work, and it is a compressed time frame. You're looking at about 60 days. But when it's broken down into sections and what needs to be evaluated next, what needs to be prepared next, and really where you need to get your approvals, it's really a manageable task.
Have you found that your IT group has had more free time playing ping pong outside, or?
Well, the validation experience overall has really changed dramatically. When we first went live, validation could be a matter of weeks. And with many of the changes with not only cloud, but with the tools that we'll be talking about in a little bit, specifically, those tools just make validation reduced to a number of days. So everyone in IT is rather happy.
That's great. And I'm sure that your IT group took well with our IT group as well.
Absolutely.
This kind of comprehensive migration plan, that every box is checked, every possible contingency has been reviewed to make sure that we're bringing your data over in a safe and secure manner,
right,
without disrupting your business process. Because you're doing critical work in your labs.
Right.
It's not as if we won't be able to sell shoes one day.
And data integrity, making sure it's not only that the transition and the migration goes well, but data integrity is addressed, security is addressed. These issues were something that were considered, evaluated, reviewed, and transitioned beautifully. So
post-migration, moving on to the cloud, obviously there was some level of training on the new version of the software, making sure and being aware of what the platform and infrastructure that's now as a service, hosted through MasterControl was like. Did your group have to do any of that, or did MasterControl take care of literally everything?
MasterControl took care of really everything. This was a seamless transition. Going from hosted to the cloud, it was truly seamless. There was nothing that we had to do. Clearly, with any version upgrade, you will have training of staff and training of staff and the changes and the configuration and the use of the software. But that was it. And that is nothing more or less than any other transition or any other upgrade. You will always be training staff. You will always be updating standard operating procedures, job aids, things like that. So migration to the cloud was just an added benefit to us. There was no additional training that we had to do. related to staff whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Being on the cloud, a lot of the examples that people are familiar with and that a lot of our sales groups like to use is the idea of Netflix or Amazon and even online banking, is that these are things that people use in the cloud every single day. But it always makes my eye twitch just a little bit because I don't validate my Netflix account every time they roll out a new enhancement. I don't need to create documentation for Amazon when they start adding lightning deals for Black Friday. And especially in the world that we work in regulated industry, everything needs to be validated, from the servers to the infrastructure to the function and use of the software. And it's such a heavy burden for so many of our customers to have to validate all of those servers on their own, the configurations of the servers in both the test and production environments, as well as all the functional and usage requirements of the software. And we don't do this because of for fun and games. This is federally required in several regulated bodies.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of overhead that goes into validating products. And when you're on cloud using regular upgrades, that can be overwhelming using a traditional validation approach.
And MasterControl really did all of that for us.
Really?
They really did. It took the burden of our internal validation processes, and they really led the way for us. So that was really an awesome benefit.
Oh, that's wonderful. It's interesting. I've talked to some customers who are hesitant about moving to the cloud, and that they see all these barriers and roadblocks into validating in the cloud, that they'll be in a constant state of revalidation, that they won't be able to review and assess all of the different changes that are coming. And it's interesting for hearing from customers who have done it that they just don't see those roadblocks, that if you're doing a true risk assessment and true validations, that you're getting a better quality software on a regulated cadence, to have better security updates and better functionality on a regular basis.
And that is so true. That is just absolutely true. So we've really had no issues whatsoever related to that.
And what's especially important, because again, this validation isn't done because it works well for us, because we love writing test scripts, is that there's federal requirements as well as other regulatory bodies in the rest of the world requiring the need for the cloud. And honestly, being on the cloud, compliance is easier. Is that most regulated companies regulatory bodies are expecting customers to move to the cloud and being able to pull up documents and data instantaneously. I mean, certainly there's FDA findings of not having documents readily available to you during an inspection. And being on the cloud, having everything at your fingertips everywhere you are in the building, can be an extreme benefit for that. I mean, I know that you certainly just went through a regulatory inspection not that long ago.
We did.
How did MasterControl and being on the cloud help with that?
We were being inspected through a number of different sites, and with each individual site, they were accessing documents in MasterControl, training, job aids, any of the tracking reports, any of the information. It was all completely available at all of the different laboratory locations, and it was instantaneous. There were absolutely no delays, issues. Access was complete. I mean, review of the documentation provided was very successful and accepted. So glad to have it done, no question. But on the other hand, it was really very systematic. So.
Absolutely. I mean, and you'll see regulatory bodies specifically calling out the need for SaaS or cloud solutions for your QMS for regulatory inspections. And so not just the matter of moving to the cloud for your regulatory inspections, but as part of that validation, moving to a true risk-based validation. We were talking a little bit before about being on version 10 and the old validation process. Talk to me about the previous, before we move into the new improvements we've made, talk to me about your previous validation experience, about what that would entail for you and your company.
So validation with version 10 was really a matter of looking through and developing test scripts, making test scripts that would test the worst case scenarios, the most complex workflows, the most sensitive documents. working through each one of the plans and evaluating in a worst case scenario where things could go wrong. Always looking through and making sure that when we would be testing the system, to develop test scripts that would encounter those difficult situations or where there had been the highest level of risk, wanting to make sure that the system provided the information that we wanted to move forward, that gave us a sense of assurance that the system worked as expected when it needed to happen, that barriers were in place and that restrictions were in place, whether it be related to security, whether it be related to access, ensuring data integrity. So the test scripts that were involved prior to doing validation in a risk-based approach would be extensive, and they'd be very time-consuming. And the documentation associated with it was volumes. So the validation associated with prior versions of MasterControl was extensive. There's no question.
Yeah, well, it's so interesting because we see a lot of those requirements coming from the companies themselves. So the FDA has been saying since 2002 that you should do a risk-based validation approach based upon your intended use of the software. And what we would find with so many customers is they would have these insane, comprehensive, like you were describing, large edge case testing of the software to make sure that every bell and every whistle that they could use or might not use was working the way that it should. And so it's interesting to see that so much of that was self-imposed by the company and not really what the regulatory bodies were looking for. And this is where it comes into very important to have a trustworthy vendor for your cloud QMS, especially if you're doing risk-based validation, being able to trust not only the risk assessment, but the underlying documentation that's provided by your vendor. So one of the ways that we've talked about in having cloud validation be as simple as possible is, again, being able to trust that vendor. Many of the guidances on validation, and even from non-regulatory bodies like GAMP, provide recommendations of leveraging as much as documentation from your vendors as possible. You know, they're going to provide the IQ, OQ, and even PQ documentation for most of your usage. And who's going to be a better expert in the functional requirements of the software? The people who built it, or end users trying to consume it and rewrite them? And so leveraging as much of that documentation as possible really does help reduce the level of validation that you need to redo on your own. And that's truly what it is it's just redoing the same exact testing on the same exact environment, because when you're on cloud, your environment is the same as the vendor's environment. And so as we've gone through and talked about the validation, cloud validation is mostly the same high-level process of going through before. So you're going to create your validation plan, which calls out the scope of the validation, what's going to be in scope and out of scope as part of the validation package, the validation activities and the planned activities, what testing or documentation, migrations that you're going to perform, any of the deliverables or documentation that you're going to create as part of that validation package, the roles and responsibilities of those involved, who's going to do what and why, as well as outlining the overall validation strategy of how are you planning on validating the software. And this is the validation plan that you would create regardless of the validation strategy that you're approaching. The key part of your validation plan and your validation strategy is going to be looking at the risk-based approach and documenting what that risk assessment is going to look like. Certainly you don't need the details of the risk assessment, but discussing that you're going to be following a risk-based approach for this validation. For MasterControl, we try to follow our own risk-based approach of trying to save as much time as we can for our customers for the cloud environments and making as many frequent upgrades as possible with as little validation overhead. So with when we were talking about coming up with VXT, our Validation Excellence Tool, we came through and we brought in actually outside consultants and former FDA officials came in and helped build our risk assessment process for customers to be able to use. We wanted to be sure that it was going to not only help our customers in reducing their validation timeframes, but also pass regulatory inspection and be accepted by regulatory bodies.
I think that's really where one of the strengths is to really educate people on what a risk-based approach really is. It's I think even though we've said those words and we've really walked through that, until you really walk through that risk-based approach using the VXT tool, I don't know that you really have a complete understanding of what you're doing and why you're doing it. You're really evaluating how you are using MasterControl, what you're using it for, your intended use. You are taking your use of the system and saying, where are the potential gaps? Where are my risks? How is it when I use the system, is there a potential for risk, and how can I mitigate that risk? So it really is a matter of personalizing that validation to you, to your company, to your system, how you use it, to the modules you use. And it really does take, I say more than once, for you to be using the tool and really have an understanding of what you're doing when you're using a risk-based approach to your validation. So it really has been such a tremendous benefit. And I know you're going to talk about the Validation Excellence Tool that is just such an incredible stepping stone. It's such an introduction to what am I doing, why am I generating all of this documentation and paper, does it really support how I use the system? So the benefit of taking a risk-based approach really personalizes validation to you, to your organization, and how you use MasterControl in your system. Is it a matter of a repository of documents? Is this something for that you are gathering documentation for regulatory submission? Are you in a manufacturing environment where you are doing batch records and supporting documentation for release? So it really is, using a risk-based approach really allows you to personalize the validation that you need in your organization to support how MasterControl is used by you, by your staff.
No, absolutely, and it is a patented tool from MasterControl that was really designed to look at what the FDA has been saying for a risk-based approach since 2002, is that intended usage, and being able to justify the regulatory sensitivity and the high-risk functionality for the full validation. Previously, MasterControl would just say, what do you want to test?
Right.
And customers would come up with these lengthy lists like Marianne was describing that wouldn't necessarily be functionality that had changed whatsoever from the core product. And so being able to leverage and trust as much of that validation documentation from your vendor and using that as the baseline of the mitigations for your risk helps drive and focus on the areas that are critical to your business. So for example, if in your document approvals, you have a very key critical data that you need to review to make sure it functions the way that it should, we want to focus our testing on making sure that your custom fields are set up the way they need to if you're driving that for business decisions, as opposed to checking every numbering series on every info product,
Exactly.
which may not have the same level of criticality to your business thing. Another key thing to remember about risk here too is it's not necessarily the risk of finding defects in an area. It's the risk to your business that this component introduces if something were to go wrong with MasterControl.
A potential exposure.
Exactly. And so if, for example, the documents module went down in the middle of the day for you, there'd be tons of clinical samples and laboratory tests that couldn't possibly be done.
We have downtime protocols.
Well, certainly with your business continuity.
That's easy. Got that covered.
True, but the risk of not being able to approve document is much different, say, than the risk of not being able to set up your out of office appropriately.
And actually having the availability of job aids, tools, process maps, things like that staff are using throughout the day to manage and track and ensure that processes are continuing as expected. Having that available at the workbench, at the site, literally at any computer terminal at any time, just being able to pull it up and saying, oh, this is where I am in the workflow, where's that screenshot, this is the job aid, ensuring consistency and quality in all that we're doing throughout the laboratory and the life of a specimen, as we say, ensuring quality patient care. That is what we do. That's why we do it, and MasterControl is certainly a partner in that. So validating that the availability of information is available to staff at any location at any time, literally from any computer workstation throughout multiple laboratories at any time.
And that sounds like a really great user acceptance test that you do every release,
Yes.
which is, I think, is a key differentiator that we want to make for VXT. Because VXT is designed to help you figure out exactly what level of formal validation has to be done on individual components on an upgrade. Not necessarily like whether or not you should be doing user acceptance testing on individual functions. Because validation is the documentation that you put in place to prove that the system meets your requirements. But you still want to be doing user acceptance tests for your general configuration items to make sure that is the system configured the way that I want it to be. And it can, and obviously UAT test, UAT or user acceptance testing is not documented. It's not formal. You don't need to be a pre-approval for protocols and things like that. It's very ad hoc and simple that you do to make sure that the system's working the way that you expect it to, as opposed to formal validation.
Right.
And really that's what VXT is designed to do, is cut down the level of formal validation and that heady documentation process of writing protocols and getting them pre-approved and going through that whole cycle of getting them ready to be executed, formal execution, formal review, et cetera, when you can leverage so much of that testing from MasterControl.
Well, it's also understanding that once you have VXT in place, that as long as when the next upgrade comes and you're reevaluating, okay, have I changed my use? Has any of my intended use changed? Have I added any modules to the system? Have we expanded or grown in any way that we need to reevaluate and continue that risk-based assessment? If you have not changed your use and you have not made changes as far as the modules you're using or how you're using them, then it's truly change control thereafter. And change control is something that is really very straightforward, that you just manage in your daily processes. So the validation associated with any additional upgrades is really significantly reduced if you can come back and say, my risk has not changed because I haven't changed the use of the system. I have not made changes that would warrant an additional risk assessment. So,
yeah, I mean, if your business process hasn't changed,
exactly,
then there's not necessarily need to go in and revalidate that business process.
Right.
And so, Marianne, let's talk about the difference between the validating and upgrading before VXT and after. So how long, on average, would you say you spend from beginning to end validating an upgrade before moving to cloud with VXT?
Oh, gosh.
Or not even an upgrade, but maybe even an initial implementation.
With initial implementation, I know it was at least a month. Yeah, it was at least a month of ongoing testing and review. And it, as you said earlier, it was self-imposed because looking at, and yet it was initial, looking at what we were doing and how we were doing it, wanting to make sure. I think it probably really bordered on reinforcing our own self-training of the system. When we were literally walking through, that was partly how we trained ourselves and how the system worked. Well, that wasn't the point of validation, but that just showed how much extra work we were doing.
And what about after? What about moving to VXT? How long would you say validation did for your upgrade to 11.7?
The validation with 11.7, we partnered with professional services in MasterControl, and so they were guiding us through a number of the PQ test scripts. So that was a set time frame, but what I can say with 2019.3 validation with VXT was a total of 2 days.
Wow.
So the time frame and the very systematic approach was just well received.
So going from 1 month of work to 2 days of work.
Right.
And I know you had gone through regulatory inspection, and there was no question, no concerns with the VXT and the validation documentation that was provided.
Nothing. Exactly. So it was a matter of showing what we did, why we did it, walking through explanations, being comfortable with providing the information to the inspectors, and it was pretty straightforward.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful to hear.
Yeah. So our latest upgrade was with 2019.3, and we have been on an annual cadence for validation. And I have to say that the Validation Excellence Tool and the actual process itself has just become so systematic that it really is a natural transition for us to progress to quarterly upgrade. We want the benefits of the changes that are being made. We want that the growth and the changes and the improvements in the system. So in that regard, it's a bit selfish. But also in looking at planning from a business plan, sometimes the fall quarter is impacted by other activities that are not under our control, and just dividing things up into a quarterly validation tool, it's a reasonable business approach for us when so many other operational activities are happening in the fall that are not within our control. So moving to a quarterly validation it really is the way that we need to go next. So that will be coming soon.
Well, that's so exciting and wonderful to hear.
Yeah.
One of the things I want to touch on as well is this idea of industry acceptance of risk-based validation. You know, we touched on this a lot during this presentation of how self-imposed the rigmarole of the validation documentation is. It's not what the regulatory bodies are looking for. And it feels like a lot of it is just considered as industry standard. Well, of course, this is how you do validation. And to do validation in any other way is not the standard and not what industry expects. And it's so fascinating to have that mindset, because bloodletting used to be industry standard for doctors, and not having iPhones and cell phones were never industry standard, and I don't think I ever leave the house without my phone in my hand. And so as standards are meant to change, trends are meant to change, and so it's just so interesting that regulated industry clings as much as it does to the industry standards without wanting to make any steps forward when stepping forward is progress.
We're getting better every day.
Absolutely. So if you would like to learn more about our validation process and strategy internally at MasterControl, or how the VXT works, please come visit the validation page on our customer website and our cockpit page for resources for moving to the cloud, as well as white papers, case studies, data sheets, tons of industry research about moving to the cloud to learn more about this process. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. Thank you, Marianne, so much for joining as well and providing your insights.
It has been an absolute pleasure to be here. I really want to thank you for giving us the opportunity for us to share all the successes that we've had.
Great, and so now we'll transfer to a Q&A portion of the webinar. Please submit your questions through the webinar, and we'll answer as many as we can as time allows. All right. Has VXT ever been inspected during a regulatory body inspection and passed? So Marianne, I will pass that off to you, given that you just went through one 2 weeks ago.
We did, and the information that was reviewed really was explanation of the risk-based approach, the explanation of VXT and how we were working through the validation and walking through the critical elements as to how we use the system. The questions were answered. I was comfortable in answering the questions that were posed to me, and there were no outstanding issues. So they were familiar with the risk-based approach and moved forward.
That's great. Okay. So our question is, how do you upgrade on a quarterly cadence? Isn't that overwhelming?
Actually, with a quarterly, you have 30 days. So you have a 30-day planning period. With annual, you only have a 30-day planning period. So now you actually have more time to do less work. So quarterly, really, when you look at it like that, you're really being given more notice, more time to review the span of work, the scope of work, and the scope of what has to be validated. From a time perspective, you're really maximizing your time because you're going to be validating less. There are fewer changes in quarterly than there are in annual.
Well, and accepting that risk-based approach like we talked about before is that, if you were doing traditional validation, you couldn't be on a quarterly cadence.
Exactly.
But going from 30 days to 2 days
Right.
gives you a lot more leeway in that 30-day window to get your validations done.
Exactly. And a lot more time to bring other people alongside so that they can assist in this. You can use this as a training tool to expand your workforce. So
Marianne, this question looks like it's for you. You mentioned that there was quite a bit of work about moving to the cloud. Can you explain what work you guys had to do on your end?
So it really was the work associated with the upgrade prior to going to the cloud. So there were so many changes associated with the transition between 10.1.2 and 11.7. And the transition to the cloud was just an added step. The work was really associated with how much the software changed and how many changes there were and improvements in the software and the opportunities that we had to use the system better. So really looking at the transitions and the work associated between the transition between 10.1.2 and 11.7, the work was really associated with those upgrade changes, not moving to the cloud. The moving to the cloud part of it was really seamless. It was just an added benefit to having the upgrade happen and working through the upgrade process. So it was really upgrade related. So for those individuals who are working from a more current version, the transition to the cloud would not be as challenging or as time consuming as it had been for us. So,
well, and that certainly sounds like a pitch for being on a more upgraded version, upgrading on a regular cadence, whether it's annual or quarterly, and so that you don't have that huge burden of fully revalidating the software.
Exactly. So.
A question we have is, how does VXT assess risk? So VXT breaks up the risk assessment into two sections. There's a MasterControl software risk assessment as well as a client risk assessment. The first time that you use VXT, it provides a holistic risk approach, because you could be coming in as a new customer, you could be upgrading from any of our previous versions. And so we want to look at the risk from a general high-level approach. So the MasterControl software risk looks at things like, is this component part of our best practices? MasterControl has been configuring and validating our software for 26 years. We have a strong idea of what a good, scalable model of our software is. And so with each of our components, we say, is this part of the best practices recommendation for using our software? We look at the impact of failure, of how bad is your day if this component does not work the way that we expect it to. And then we also look at what mitigations do we have in place. How well have we tested this functionality through our transfer operational qualifications, our TOQs. And those are kind of lockdown scores from MasterControl. But that's not what makes VXT special. Every software company does that. What really makes VXT special is that client risk assessment that Marianne would do. Exactly. Looking at the intended usage of how are you actually using the software to comply with regulatory standards to determine the risk. So do you want to talk a little bit about that process?
Yes, because this was so incredibly educational, and it really taught me more about VXT and really what risk assessment is. It's one thing when the developer of the software is able to identify, oh, this is really a high-risk area. But if you as the client don't use that portion of the software, then even though it is high risk from a software standpoint, if that's not a part that you use in the system, then whether or not that needs to be validated, you'll find out at the end of your risk assessment. But it would be more likely that if that's not how you use the system, that's not something you need to focus on in your validation. So that, in that way, that risk assessment tool really personalizes how the software was made and how you use the system. And that's really the strength of your validation. So if something is only of a moderate risk, but in your use, in your organization, if this is a very high risk situation and needs to be very well managed, then that's something you're going to want to focus on in your validation, and perhaps that's an area that you're going to want to run an additional test script or two. So it really personalizes how the software was made, what testing they have done to ensure the outcome, and how you use the system, how you use that particular component or that element of the functionality of the software. So that's really the benefit of the risk-based approach. It marries the vendor risk with the client risk and how you use a system.
And it's so important to look at intended usage. So when we talk about this in other conversations, how you use a function determines its risk. So we have a functionality called Explore Export, which I'm sure you've used, Marianne, where you can take your file folders and documents within them and export them to a zip file on your desktop or to a shared location or to wherever you prefer. And so from the MasterControl perspective, there's one risk for that. We're not creating records, we're just kind of exporting copies of a record and storing it outside the system. A company A might use that for regulatory submissions of packaging of their DHF or their TMF. Company B might use that for their disaster recovery of having their SOPs. Company, or I personally use it to send documents to coworkers. And so from a software perspective, that's the exact same functionality. So that risk might be low or medium because it's from a software, it's very, very low. But your intended usage drastically changes that risk of that component, which is why it's so important to look at that client risk assessment. So we capture that as part of the risk assessment through the regulatory sensitivity that we include in the client risk assessment. We'll also look at subjective risk assessment of, we recognize that different companies have different risk tolerances.
Exactly.
Is that some companies are just 100% trustful of MasterControl, they'll accept every document that we create and see no need to do further validation. Other companies may have gotten burned in the past from other vendors or have had bad experiences and will have to be a lot more cautious and more risk adverse. And we want to take that into account as part of our risk assessment. So we wanted to include a very subjective risk score from the customer of what is your risk tolerance for this component, or even if it's previous experience. I've had companies that had gotten 483s in the past because the reporting functionality they were using for a different software wasn't validated, was giving out bad data, and they were making business decisions on that bad data. Or companies who like the reports but don't really ever use them. And so they're going to give very different levels of risk assessment to those reports. We also look at the usage testing that MasterControl does as mitigation for VXT, as well as how closely you follow our best practices. Like I said before, we have been configuring and validating our software for 26 years. We have a good idea of what a scalable, usable model of our software is. The further you stray from that, the higher your risk of the use of our software is.
And I'm really glad you brought that up, because best practices, when you are upgrading, it really is so important. It really is a step back for you to be able to say, hey, wait a minute, where have I deviated from best practices? Have I veered to the left or veered to the right? Or have there been practices that really are not consistent with how the software really should be used at this point? Having that time during that upgrade experience to look at best practices and how others in the organization are continuing to use the software, this is your kind of step back and reassessment of, we need to get back on track. We need to look at best practices. Not only will this enhance our experience, it will enhance the validation process, and you will have a better use of the system. You'll have a better outcome. So it really is a step back when you're upgrading, when you're using the VXT tool, to really look at those best practices. And you may need to realign. I know we did. So, and that was great.
It's so interesting. I know we're on a bit of a tangent here, but it's so interesting to see customers when they initially onboard MasterControl go into these very complex configurations, or they try to take their current paper model or their current business process and shoehorn it into MasterControl.
Right.
And then you see over the years, as they've gotten used to using it, they tend to go closer back to the best practice of, here's more of a simpler configuration of all the bells and whistles we were trying to use and the bad process we were trying to make go faster. Just doesn't work out for us. And so we see those customers come back and reconfigure and simplify as they move on.
Like, why did I go electronic if I'm just going to mirror my bad practices that I was doing in paper? It's, Yeah, so really getting a handle on what those best practices were and staying aligned to them is such a benefit.
Yeah, and certainly as we move up on the quarterly releases, we assess our best practices every release and review them and provide new best practices every single release, because new enhancements might change how we recommend you use the software.
Oh, absolutely. I know that there were a number of workflows that we were able to eliminate, and eliminating workflows changes a number of different aspects of the configuration of the system. Simplifying and saying, wait a minute, really, let's take a look at those best practices and see what I can do to make the system run better, function better, operate better. Can't say enough about that. So.
Okay, we'll go to another question. So Marianne, this looks like it's a question for you. How did you get your IT group to be so on board with moving to the cloud?
This was not the first application that has moved to the cloud, to a cloud-based environment. So knowing that MasterControl has been a trusted partner for a number of years prior to that time, moving to the cloud was just a natural transition. It was the next step for the application. So IT was very much on board when I went to them and said, hey, we'd like to move to the cloud, and they just said, great. This was not the first application to go to the cloud, so it was really very much the next step.
Not your first rodeo.
No, it wasn't. I mean, it may have been my first rodeo, but it wasn't theirs, which was the great thing. So,
well, that's excellent. Thank you so much for all of your questions. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them today, but thank you for joining us here on the webinar. As any additional questions, we will follow up with you separately outside of this call. And Marianne, thank you so much for your time again. It's really been a pleasure seeing you.
Absolutely. It's been great. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.